Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is good to be here. I know you're supposed to say that kind of stuff because we're at church, right? And you could be somewhere else. I understand that. You could be curled up under your covers in bed. You could be laying on the couch. But man, it is good to be here. Part of the value for me in being here is that I'd get in trouble with the elders if I wasn't. But the other part is that I love watching and being with people who are worshiping God. And I don't mean that in that kind of intangible way, but just seeing people being moved by what they're singing, what the Spirit of God is doing. So I'm glad to be here, even if you're not. My name is Patrick. I am one of the ministers here, and we're in the middle of a series, and we're working through the book of Colossians. Back in the day, so the youth group sits over here, and you guys probably might not know this, and maybe you do, and I just don't understand the youth of today. But it used to be back in the day when you heard a song on the radio, which I know most people don't listen to the radio anymore, you would think, oh, I like that song, and I want to listen to it more, so you'd have to go buy the album. Do you remember buying the album? But there was a risk involved in buying the album, because what if the only song in the album that was good was that one song that they played on the radio, and you would just have wasted, $16.50 or whatever. CDs weren't cheap, tapes weren't cheap, records weren't cheap, 8-tracks weren't cheap, whatever era you grew up in, and you had to risk it. And it was so frustrating when you bought this album, and there was only the one song, they were one-hit wonder, and they were never going to do anything else. And it was so awesome when you bought the album, and just every song was a hit. I think that the passage we're reading today feels like that. It just feels like you're listening to the greatest hits of Paul. If you were to do a desert island experiment and you could only take one book of the Bible or one scrap of Scripture, this would be it. If you could take just this, and I know that's too small to read, so you have to get it in your Bibles and open it up, but if you could just take Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 17, I think you would be nailing it. I think your life would be transformed. I think you would have almost everything you needed, and you're like, well, why do we have the rest of the Bible? It's all good. I'm just telling you, this stuff it's every line is a gem. It's like a rusting nesting doll, of Russian nesting doll. Did I say that backwards? Of truth, right? Every time you pull something apart, you're like, wow, it gets better and it gets deeper and it gets more intense and more thoughtful. It's just so good. It's for everyone. You could be a brand new Christian, and this is just so good. You should commit this to memory. But you could have been around the block. I mean, you could have grown up in the church. You could have heard it all twice, 3 times. You could preach the sermon, and this is still good. This is stuff that we need constantly in the very core of our being. I'm excited that we're talking about it today. It's kind of, I don't know, some of you are action-oriented, and you just want, tell me what to do. And this passage has all the do's. And some of you are more philosophical and theological, and you're like, I want to understand why. This passage has that too. It's like the Swiss Army knife of Bible verses. It's so good. And the reason I think it's valuable in a nutshell is that it outlines this entire process of spiritual transformation. And I'm going to make a huge assumption this morning. I'm going to assume that you came to church at least with some part of your being that was interested in being a new person, that was interested in maybe taking a step in a different direction, or at least was open to the idea that maybe there was something else. I don't know where you are, but I think some people may have come to church guarded, come to church I don't know, I'm kind of just exploring things, but there's some part of you that wants to take a step forward in some way. Maybe it's even just taking a step in believing in God at all, and that's fine too. And I think this verse has it. It's got the whole thing. Now, this sounds bland. We threw this up here. This sounds so bland. Status energizes transformation. It sounds like something that you would hear at some sort of weekend corporate conference, and it just doesn't mean anything, and synergy and all just all that corporate speak. But I'm telling you, I think this is the key to everything. As bland and boring as that sounds, I think this is exactly what Paul's talking about in this passage, and I use this bland, boring way of explaining it because I think it's going to be memorable. I think you're going to remember what Paul's saying in this passage. So let's dig in. It's huge. A longer way of saying this is what you actually believe Christ has done in you compels what you will actually do in Christ. What you believe Christ has done in you compels what you'll do in Christ. And so if you don't believe he's done very much, well, you don't do very much. But if you believe he's fundamentally transformed the type of human that you are, well, then it's going to transform what you do. It's going to transform the way you think, the way you believe, and the way you interact in the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine this passage in big, broad terms, and then we're going to get really granular and specific. And we're going to move around the passage like notes on a piano. It's not going to stay in one spot. So if you have your Bibles open, that would be awesome, but your eyes are going to have to jump around the page a little bit. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the word status, as boring as that sounds. Kids go through these shifts of development. I know, big news, right? Wow, Patrick, I got out of bed for that. But they go from being a baby to being, or a newborn to being a baby to toddler, and every stage has like good and bad with it. Like, I don't know, do you remember when your kid started to be able to crawl and you were so excited for them to crawl, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I got to chase the kid around now. And they're going for the stairs, or when they went from crawling to walking, or do you remember the point when they stopped taking naps? And it was the end of an era for you too, because when they were taking naps, it just freed up your afternoon. You could take a nap, you could do what you wanted, but they stopped, and it's just like, oh, now I have to be on 24/7. When your kid goes from needing you to help them go to the bathroom to being able to do it on their own, it is life-changing. You don't even realize. You're like a prisoner of war that has been set free, because all of a sudden, your entire daily schedule does not revolve around the potty habits of this tiny human. I remember it vividly when my 11-year-old was able to go to the bathroom by himself. I remember I was sitting in our living room at our house, and we had put Liam to bed, and his door was closed, and I'm sitting down there, I'm sure, reading my Bible, I don't know, probably watching something, and I heard the door open, and I look up to see, like, oh, what does he need? He needs a drink of water. He needs us to say goodnight again. You know how kids are. And he didn't look at us at all. He just walked from his room right across the hallway to the bathroom, shut the door, and I'm like, uh-oh, what's going on here? So that's usually not good, too. Then I heard the toilet flush. I didn't hear the faucet. I decided not to worry about it. Then I heard him go back across the hallway and get back in bed, and I'm like, my life has changed. My life has changed. He's gone through this shift, and hey, I no longer need to do this. I no longer need to be a part of this. That's huge, and we celebrate those. But I remember the first time we dropped our oldest daughter off at college 600 miles away, and we pulled out, and she's standing there in the rearview mirror. The whole family is just puddles of tears. That same 11-year-old who's 11 years now was curled up in the fetal position in the back seat. We were just crying because it's a shift. It's new. It's different. And it's one that's tough to adjust to. We have these status changes in life, and we have to understand how we interact with them. And ignoring the shifts is a recipe for failure. You have seen kids who want to grow up too quickly. They want to take on too many adult responsibilities and too many adult identities, and you're like, no, hold on to that innocence for as long as you possibly can. And then sometimes you have parents who don't want to let their kids grow up, and they treat them like they're dependent children long after they're capable of doing something on their own. But forgetting this change in status is a recipe for disaster. I didn't know my sister was going to be here in the room today. She's here with us by the grace of God because she tried to kill herself several times just by being a kid and being silly when she was a kid. One time we were driving somewhere, and I just remember sitting in the back seat, and we were driving somewhere, and she just opened up the door and decided to get out of the car. Now, fortunately, we were in the parking lot, and I just think she had forgotten we were driving. She was probably 7 or 8 years old. Do you remember this? You do remember it. I'm glad. See, I'm not making stuff up. Opens the door, and she realizes once the door's open and she's exited the vehicle that, oh, we're not in a parking spot, and she's holding on to the door as we're going, and I think my mom probably noticed what was happening, or my dad, or whoever was driving, and they stopped the car, and everything was fine, and she was fine. It was fine. But it was stuff like that. Oh, you forget you're driving somewhere and you try to exit the vehicle? Bad news. You forget where you are. You forget what's going on. I heard a guy talk about his wedding ceremony, and he loved the wedding. He loved everything about it, but he was really excited about the reception. So they did that thing where you get married, and then you send all your guests to another location for the reception while you take all the pictures, which is not fun for the guests, but I understand why you got to do it. So they're taking all the pictures, and he's just so excited to get the reception that after the pictures are done, he hops in the car, goes to the reception, and he's greeting people. He's like, hey, how are you doing? I'm so excited. And people are like, hey, where's your new bride? And horror, as he realizes he has forgotten his brand new wife. The very first act of marriage is he forgot he was married. And they're doing great now, by the way. Lots of therapy. You have to keep in mind the status change. And Paul weaves this idea throughout the text. I want to show you some points at where he does this. I've got some verses, but in verse 1, verse 3, verse 7, verse 9, he says, you have been raised with Christ. This is true. This is reality. This is who you are. This is what's going on. You have been raised with Christ. You died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. You used to walk in these ways. You have taken off your old self. And the problem with that is those things are true, but they're not necessarily completely part of our lives yet. They're true. They have happened. Our kids have grown up. We have gotten married. These new realities exist, but now we have to learn to behave in conformity with the way things really are. And I think we have to keep in mind the status change, because I think we're never really going to behave differently if we are not convinced that because of Christ we really are different, that we're really made new, that this is really the way things are now. I'm about to say something that's going to be easy to misunderstand. We live, as Christians, we live in overlapping realities. We are raised with Christ, he says. Therefore, seek things above. We are dead, and then he says, therefore, now put to death these things in your life. You used to walk in these ways, therefore, stop walking in those ways. But Paul does not say that because that our status has changed, that we are dead, we are raised, all that. He doesn't say that we will no longer behave poorly and that we will not mess up. And one of the things that we struggle with within Christianity is like we read these realities that these things are now true for us, and then when we mess up, we just melt into a puddle of guilt and shame because we're not supposed to do those things anymore. And we know that, and we're like, I should be better, and what's wrong with me? And Paul is saying, listen, you have to understand that we live in overlapping realities. What is true, now you're trying to make true in your life. It is true, and you're still trying to bring it to reality in your life and the way that you behave. So to fall short doesn't mean we should fall apart. To mess up doesn't mean we should give up. Christians, this is our problem, is that we do something we shouldn't do, and we're like, in for a penny, in for a pound. I mean, I already messed up now. And that's not the way it is. We've got to bring that new reality, that new status to life, to reality in our own lives. I kind of wonder, what if we did like a little Mr. Rogers thing? You know how he came home after, I don't even know where he was. Where was he before he walked in the house? But wherever he was, he took off the suit jacket, probably worked, and he put on the cardigan, right? He said, all right, I am no longer Mr. Rogers, the whatever, and now I'm Cardigan Mr. Rogers. And this is the one we like, you know, the different shoes, the house cardigan. What if every time we mess up and we do that thing that we've been struggling with and we know we shouldn't do, we just think of it like, okay, this is not who I am anymore. I'm taking that off, and I am taking on this new identity of Christ. And we have to do that hundreds, thousands, millions of times to bring the new reality that Christ has made true into existence, into our lives. I think that would be so valuable. I think that would be so important. But he doesn't just talk about status. He talks about transformation. If you're kind of type A action-oriented, let's talk about that. He says, you're raised, now set your heart and mind on things above. You died, now put to death those old ways. You changed, now put off those old ways. Social media has become an endless supply of short 10 to 30-second videos. Have you noticed this? That's all it is now. And once, I don't know, Snapchat or TikTok or whatever, now even Facebook. And I know some of you are like, I've been on Facebook since 2008 so I could keep up with my classmates. And now all you do is get on Facebook. What do they call it? Is it Reels? Where you just watch one after another, and pretty soon it's 2 a.m. You're like, what happened? Where did it go? But that's all social media is turning into. And there's a whole genre of videos where people are having very public meltdowns. There's a word for this, and I'm not going to use it because people who have this name, it's a human name, but we call humans who have this sort of meltdown a certain name. You know what I'm talking about? Hey, don't say it. Anyway, let me show you this picture. This is just two from this week. Here's a here's a gentleman who's punching a car window, and I read a little bit behind the scenes, and he was trying to make a U-turn in a parking lot, and another car came along and didn't understand what he was doing and kind of got in his way, and he got really furious, and he's trying to punch the car window. And he didn't punch it, which kind of made it funny because he's so mad, but he can't really do anything about it, and, anyway, it's kind of funny. This other one is a lady that her flight got canceled, I believe, and so she jumped behind the counter and just started trashing the place. Just lost it. Just completely lost it, trashing the place. Now, these videos are hard to watch, but they're also kind of hard to look away from. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, man, I would never. Maybe I would imagine myself doing something like that, but I would never. Because my guess is that there's more context to the videos. There's probably something more going on than we get actually in that 10 seconds. But the implication is that they're overreacting to something that is not minor, but something that is relatively unimportant, and they're vastly overreacting. And everybody agrees. There's whole genres of videos. There's whole accounts that publish these kinds of videos because everybody, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, it doesn't matter where you are in your life, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. Everybody believes this is ridiculous, right? We all agree that that's silly. And so we all kind of like to watch it so we can all actually agree about something in our divided world. Now, it's extreme, but it's universal. And I picked these two things because neither of these situations, neither of them are Americans. You can imagine Americans doing this left and right, but it's worldwide. It's global. People all over the world have these very public meltdowns, and somebody's videoing it because everybody's got a camera now. But everyone agrees this is inappropriate. And even the guilty people will later say, yeah, that was inappropriate. I behaved poorly. That isn't me. That's not who I want to be, right? And I'm no psychologist at all, but I think some of the reason that people all agree that this is completely ridiculous and inappropriate is because it's dehumanizing. Humans shouldn't act like that, right? Humans shouldn't behave that way. And we can all agree, losing it in public like that, unless there's some piece of the story that we totally don't understand, is wrong. Paul is about to give us a couple sketches of dehumanizing behavior in the text. And I want to show you what he writes. Sketch number 1 is Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. And he writes, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed." He says, put that to death. Whatever belongs, this is who you were, and now, because you're changed, you need to start putting that to death. Now, if you look at that list, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, you know the theme in there? Even the words that aren't directly related to sexual sin have an element of it that feels like he's kind of encompassing all this behavior. And it's moving from exterior to interior behaviors. But what I believe Paul's writing is he's saying those things, that sexual immorality, that impurity, that lust, that evil desires, those greed, those are dehumanizing behaviors. They dehumanize us. We're still in kind of the midst of, a 50-year or so social experiment about casting off restraint when it comes to human sexuality. And I'm not trying to argue that the way humans have done it for thousands of years is the right way, but I'm saying we're in this moment, this cultural moment where we're saying, no, if anybody tries to create a boundary, tell them no, that's not okay. And so we're all over the place with it. And I don't know that humans, on a whole, feel like they're better off because they've cast off these restraints. Even at the end of that, there's a really interesting a couple books that have been written recently, and not by Christian authors, One is by Louise Perry, and she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She worked in a rape crisis center in England, and as a journalist, just saw the same themes over and over and over. And she makes the case that the last 50 years of casting off sexual boundaries has been terrible for humanity, and in particular, women. And in the book, it's kind of interesting because you read the reviews of the book and people are like, oh, she's so brave and she's so daring and she's so provocative. And do you know what she advocates as a solution or the case against the sexual revolution? You know what she says? She says commitment and monogamy. That's what's brave and daring. Commitment and monogamy. She's not a Christian writing this. Because I think people, even in our world, are realizing that these behaviors are dehumanizing. They don't make us better people. They actually make things overall worse for everyone. And it's transforming our culture. And there's people who are beginning to realize that and push against it and say, I don't think that's the way things should be. She writes this quote, "We should prioritize virtue over desire. We should not assume that any given feeling we discover in our hearts or our loins ought to be acted upon." I mean, it sounds like stuff that Christians have had access to for a long time, for thousands of years. The second sketch that Paul writes is in Colossians chapter 3, verses 9, starting in verse 9. He says, "Now you also must rid yourself of all things such as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other. You've taken off your old self with its practices." Again, do you notice a theme? Like anger and the way that we interact with people and the way we dehumanize others through our anger. Now, I'm curious why he picks on these two categories. I mean, there's more sin in the world than just sexual sin and anger, right? Why these two categories? Why are these the ones he sort of settles on in this passage? I love watching documentaries, and as a confession, I'm not saying this is good, I particularly love watching documentaries about scandals in religious institutions because it's interesting on one level, but on another level, you're like, how do you avoid that kind of stuff happening? And the problem is a documentary about a religious institution, it's never good. It's never like, oh, here was a group of Jesus-loving people and they made the world a better place at the end, you know? Nobody makes those kind of documentaries. You're watching these really influential religious organizations and sometimes churches themselves that turn into these unjust and corrupt places. And do you know at the end of that series of shows or the end of that 90 minutes of documentary, do you know what always is going to be the heart of the problem? Always. Sometimes, but rarely is it money. Sometimes, but rarely. It's always sexual immorality and abuse through anger. It's always those two things where churches and religious institutions just completely go off the rails and cause all kinds of damage in the world. And I think Paul's aware of that, aware that this should not be the way the church ever is. This should not be the impact that the church has on the world. All that behavior is dehumanizing and dishonoring to God. We are recreated into new humans. Look at what he says. This is the right sketch of how humans should be. Colossians chapter 3, verse 10. He says, "We've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there's no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all." And that's where we get our series title, Christ is All. And here's what it looks like. Verse 12, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience." And he talks about forgiveness, and he talks about letting peace rule in your heart. It's all the stuff. If we were to live like that, if that were to be the reality, if that were to be our world, we would love every day of life because this is the way things are supposed to be and the way that Christians are supposed to be and the way that we're moving toward, the reality that we're moving toward. That's what it's all about. So these are big, broad ideas, I know, but understanding that Jesus has fundamentally changed the category we exist in encourages, compels transformation. Now let's move way in. Let's zoom way in as we wrap this up. What does this actually look like? When I was probably 9 or 10, I watched a movie. And it wasn't even a scary movie, but sometimes things are scary when you're 9 or 10 that aren't supposed to be scary. And it was a dream sequence in this movie. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm actually curious if anybody happens to remember this. It's from 1985. And there's a scene in which one of the main characters is having a hallucination. And they're walking through a cemetery. And it's spooky and gloomy and foggy. And at one point in this movie, a skeleton hand reaches out from one of the gravestones and grabs the character and pulls them down, right? And I knew it was a movie. I knew it was make-believe. I knew it was a dream sequence within the movie. And yet, for about 12 months, every single morning, I would wake up, I would think about the fact that a skeleton hand might reach out from under my bed, and I would pull my legs up to my bed, and I would jump as far away from my bed as I could to get out of their reach. Every morning, that had such an impact on me, even though I knew it was true. Even though during the day, when everything was normal and the light was on, I would check under there, and I knew there was nothing. For a year, I did a long jump out of my bed because of that movie. I mean, that's kind of crazy. That's kind of nuts to think about that. I think that idea, that mental image of this thing trying to reach out and grab you, is what we should have in our minds when we're thinking about this passage. I think Paul is employing that mental image. You have been freed from sin. That's the status change. You're free from sin. Now, go live your life, but you have sin that wants to reach out from the grave and drag you back in. And your job as a Christian is to fight that off. Sin in your own life, sin in your own heart wants to reach out and drag you back into death and into decay. And your job is to fight against that. And if you have to get on your bed and jump as far as you can every morning, then that's what you need to do. You need to fight against the reality that this new status change we're trying to be dragged away from it. That's the mental image. I've told you many times that I grew up as a kid in Taiwan, subtropical country. They have insects the size of rodents there. And you have to be very careful with where you put your hand and where you step and it's disgusting. I was going to show you a picture of some of the spiders, and I thought, nope, I would just lose everybody because they'd be so grossed out that they wouldn't hear anything else I had to say. But I'll tell you this story. I was taking a shower, and I had carelessly put my clean t-shirt on the ground and didn't think about it. And when I got done drying off, put my t-shirt back on, a spider had crawled inside the shirt. Spider, I want to say it's about this big, but it's not. I want to tell you that. It's like a fishing story. Let me tell you, I ripped that shirt right back off. And that's exactly the language that Paul the Apostle employs. He says you have to rid yourself of those attitudes and thoughts and behaviors in your own heart. You have to pull them right back off. You clothe yourself with compassion, but you rip off this other stuff. You rip off this old way of being. That's the language. This is important. We're going to wrap up. I'll tell you one more story here in a second, but this is important. Some forms of modern Christianity have little room for failure, and it's tragic. And so what we learn to do, and I had learned this in my own faith walk, I had learned to pretend everything was okay. And what was happening is my inner person and my exterior presentation were getting further and further apart because I didn't feel like there was room for me to be authentic in failure and say, nope, I'm struggling. This is hard. And there's a lot of churches, and there's churches that still exist, and sometimes it's in us, that when you mess up, you're just afraid that people are going to be like, what is wrong with you? And you're just overcome with guilt and shame. And I think what happens is you get so disintegrated between who you really are and the public perception people have of you that you tell people that there's just no hope in trying. There's no hope in trying to bring those two back together until something very painful or public happens. Other forms of Christianity have little room for growth, little room for challenge, little room for taking people aside and saying, hey, you need to do better. This isn't who you are anymore. And they have little room for that. You mess up, it's fine, it's no big deal, and it's kind of underwhelming. Well, maybe doing the wrong thing isn't that big of a deal. I don't know. And I think the end result of that is people just don't feel compelled to try to grow. And I think we have to, as a church, we have to make room and even expectation for failure. We have to acknowledge it in one another, that we fail, we fall short, but we don't have to fall apart. That we give in, but we don't have to give up. We have to have room for both those things. We have to have room for the reality that Jesus has created in us and the reality that we're trying to make true in our lives. Those two things have to be true. Getting old is a strange experience. I'll sometimes, my daughter will take a picture of me and she'll show, here's a picture of you. And I'm like, who's the old guy? It's not me. Do you have a filter on it or something? Nope, no, that's just how you look now. Your metabolism slows when you get older. It used to be when you were young, you could be like, I should probably only have 4 or 5 donuts at a time. And as you get older, you're like, I should probably only have 4 or 5 donuts a year, maybe, right? Your eyesight dims. I was told by an ophthalmologist that by the time you're 45, you're going to need some sort of your eyesight. And you've seen old people, they start holding things like this and tilting their head back. Their eyesight's going bad. Your energy doesn't last as long. It's just, I've said this before, but it's the craziest thing that when you get old, you can injure yourself sleeping. You'll wake up in the morning and you'll be like, something's wrong. I think I got to go to the doctor. What were you doing? I was laying there for 8 hours. Right? And when you're a kid, you can sleep upside down, underneath the mattress, sideways, and it's just nothing. Doesn't matter. I've seen, I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was my son. He jumped off like the top of this playground thing, and I was like, if I did that, both my knees would just shatter, just explode. It's getting old, right? And here's the thing I think that's crazy. As you get older, and maybe this isn't true, maybe this is just me. Maybe a doctor in the room should diagnose me because I'm telling you more than you want to know. But this is what I think is weird, is you have information in your head. You know it's there, but you can't recall it. You know what I mean? It's there. You're like, I know that fact. Well, what is it? I can't pull it up right now. We're going to have to do a little reset of the database so that I can do something. I played basketball. This was before poor Terry tore his Achilles the other day. But I was going to tell this story, and I told him, hey, it's not about you. But I was playing basketball with this guy, and he hadn't played in a long time, and you just get older, and you don't realize you got older. And he played for 10 minutes. And he was standing there, and he just decided to run down the baseline to get open, and he took a couple steps, and then he stopped, and he's like, oh. And we all stopped, and we're like, are you okay? And he's like, I don't think I'm okay. And so we helped him to the sidelines, and, we were hoping maybe he could just walk it off. Nope, tore his Achilles. Because when you get older, that's just stuff that happens. You injure yourself. You're just walking one day, and you just step a little funny, and then you're in the hospital for 6 weeks, and it's getting older. The hard part, the thing that I want us to understand is spiritual life is exactly the opposite. What we should expect or what we can expect. Our spiritual vision gets stronger with maturity. And listen to me carefully. Spiritual maturity has nothing to do with age. 0. You can find very immature elderly Christians. And you can find very mature younger Christians. Spiritual maturity has nothing to do with age. Sometimes they go hand in hand, but not always. But our spiritual vision gets stronger. We can see more clearly. Our spiritual muscles get stronger. We crawl out of the grave, which is that funeral of baptism that we've started our spiritual life with, and we peel off the decay and we layer on new life. That's the spiritual walk. And if you believe what Paul is saying here, that's the reality of your life from now on, that you're constantly pulling off those old ways and those old habits, and you're adding on new and better, and it's not an upward trajectory. It's up and down and backwards and forwards. It's all over, and there's room for failure. There's room for failure, and there's room for growth, and there's a challenge for growth. And church, I think we need to accommodate all of that reality. That it's too easy just to it's too easy to just not get involved in someone's life and kind of just ignore their thing, or maybe have something go off in your head and just think, I don't know, it's not my business. We're a family. and we're helping one another not be pulled back by sin, but move on towards new life. We're going to sing a song that I think exemplifies this reality. It's called I Am Who You Say I Am. And I think that's so good because we need to be reminded of that we are who God tells us we are. We are who Jesus has made us to be. And so I think that we need to sing this song, and I've told you this before, sometimes we sing things because we believe them to be true, and sometimes we sing things in order to help us understand their truth. And so I want us to sing this song that just exemplifies this overlapping realities of the old and the new self and how we're being transformed and being renewed into the image of Christ. Would you stand as we sing this together?